I stood in my driveway, staring at the blazing orange notice taped to my front door, my hands tightening into fists. Immediate HOA fee increase, $500 monthly. Violation, excessive vehicles on property. I read it again, as if the words would somehow change. $500 every single month. For what? Having 3 cars in my own damn driveway? I looked at my so-called excessive vehicles. My work truck, a necessity for my construction business. My wife's SUV, her lifeline for getting to her 12-hour hospital shifts. And my daughter's first car, a used Honda we bought her last month for her 16th birthday. 3 cars, perfectly normal. But according to the almighty HOA, it was a crime. A slow rage burned in my chest as I glanced down the street. And there she was, Karen Mitchell, HOA president, professional busybody, self-appointed queen of the neighborhood. She strutted down the sidewalk, clipboard in hand, acting like she was some kind of law enforcement officer. Every morning, like clockwork, she did her inspection rounds, peering over fences, measuring lawns, and jotting down violations, like a mall cop with a power complex. I watched as she stopped at my driveway, pulled out her phone and started taking pictures. Again, 3rd time this week, my blood boiled. Inside, my wife, Sarah, peeked through the window. She's at it again. I exhaled slowly, forcing my hands to unclench. I know. Sarah sighed. Maybe we should just park the Honda in the garage. Number. That's exactly what Karen wanted. I poured my coffee, shaking my head. We're not hiding our daughter's car like we're doing something wrong. The garage wasn't even an option. Sarah's medical supplies and my work tools took up the space. We'd explained this at the last HOA meeting. And what did Karen say? She barely even looked up from her phone before smirking. Rules are rules, Mr. Thompson. Maybe if you can't afford proper garage storage, this neighborhood isn't for you. I gritted my teeth. Karen didn't know. None of them knew. For the past 5 years, I'd been buying up properties in the neighborhood under different LLC names. It started as a business investment. But as Karen's power trip grew worse, it became something more, a plan. A long game. And today, it was time to put it into motion. I walked outside, stretching as if I didn't have a care in the world. I strolled to the mailbox, pretending not to notice Karen's beady eyes watching me like a hawk. From the corner of my eye, I saw her clutching her clipboard tighter. I reached into my pocket, pulling out my phone, a text from my lawyer. Property closing complete. You now own 67% of the development. I smirked. Karen had no idea what was coming. That afternoon, Karen made her move. She power-walked across the street, her signature pink clipboard clutched to her chest like a holy artifact. Mr. Thompson, she called, her voice sickly sweet. I trust you received your violation notice. I folded my arms, keeping my expression neutral. I did, and I have some questions. She didn't flinch. She loved this. She lived for moments like this, moments where she could exercise her tiny, insignificant bit of power over people who actually had real lives. She waved her hand dismissively. The board has full authority to implement fees as needed. Perhaps if you attended more meetings, you'd understand how these things work. I bit back a grin. She had no idea. I'd attended every single meeting for the past 5 years, through proxies. Every time a house went up for sale, I bought it through a different company. I placed quiet, unassuming residents in those homes, people who sat in meetings, took notes, and voted. I had records of everything, every shady fee, every selective fine, every petty abuse of power. Karen turned, already satisfied with her little victory, but then she paused. Oh, she added, almost as an afterthought, The board is calling an emergency meeting tonight, 7 p.m. sharp. We'll be discussing additional measures about problem properties. I gave her a polite nod. I'll be there. She smirked. She thought she'd won. She had no idea. That night I arrived at the community centre early. The room was packed, more than usual. Karen must have gone door to door, rallying her loyal followers. She stood at the front of the room, dressed in her usual pastel power suit, tapping her sparkly pink gavel for attention. "Let's begin," she said, her voice dripping with authority. A giant projector screen flashed to life. The first slide, a zoomed-in photo of my driveway. I raised an eyebrow. Seriously. Karen clicked to the next slide. A dramatic chart. Something about property values. Next slide, a close-up photo of my daughter's Honda, encircled in red like it was evidence in a criminal investigation. Then came the binder. Karen held it up triumphantly. "In this binder," she declared, "I have documented every instance of excessive vehicle usage on Mr. Thompson's property." I blinked. Did she just say? She flipped the pages dramatically, reading off dates and times like she was giving a courtroom testimony. March 10th, a blue pickup truck parked overnight. March 15th, an SUV parked for longer than 24 hours. March 22nd, a third vehicle remained stationary for 3 consecutive days. She slammed the binder shut, looking around the room like she'd just solved a murder case. Silence. Then, a muffled chuckle from the back. Karen's eye twitched. "Something funny, Mr. Thompson?" I stood up, straightening my tie. "Just wondering," I said, "if you have similar records on all the other homes in the neighborhood." She blinked. I continued, "Because I happen to know that Mr. Chen's teenage son parks his car on the street every night, and Sarah Jenkins has 3 cars in her driveway right now." Murmurs rippled through the crowd. Karen's face reddened. That's different." "Is it?" I smiled. "Because it looks like I'm being singled out." Her eyes narrowed. "We will now vote on the new vehicle restrictions," she snapped. "All in favor?" She raised her hand. Her loyal followers did too. I let the silence drag before I spoke. "Point of order, Madam President." Karen froze. I pulled out my own folder. "I think before we vote, it's important to review the current property ownership structure of this HOA." A hush fell over the room. I walked slowly toward the front, placing a large, detailed property map on the table. For the past 5 years, a company called Sunrise Properties has been acquiring homes in this neighborhood. Karen's fingers tightened around her gavel. "And as CEO of Sunrise Properties, I thought it might interest everyone to know exactly who owns the majority of this HOA." Karen's face turned white. I smiled. Surprise. A murmur spread through the room like wildfire. Whispers. Gasps. Karen stood frozen at the front of the meeting hall, her manicured nails digging into the edges of her pink clipboard. She was calculating, scrambling for an escape route, but there wasn't one. I leaned on the podium, spreading out the detailed property map I had prepared. It was color-coded, each lot carefully marked, showing exactly who owned what. "Now, here's where it gets interesting," I said, flipping to the next page. "For the past 5 years, Sunrise Properties has been quietly acquiring homes in this neighborhood." Karen's mouth twitched. That's irrelevant." I didn't even pause. "As of today," I continued, tapping the document, "Sunrise Properties owns 67% of the development, which, if I understand HOA bylaws correctly, makes me the majority vote in this HOA." Dead silence. Karen's pink lips parted slightly, but no sound came out. And then the room erupted. "What the hell?" someone in the back whispered. Another neighbor, Mr. Rodriguez, stood up. "Wait, does that mean—" I nodded. It means I now control the HOA. Karen slammed her gavel down on the podium. No, that's not how this works. We have rules, procedures. You can't just… I pulled out another document, setting it on the table. I've had 3 different law firms review everything, Karen. It's legal. Bob, Karen's husband, had turned an alarming shade of grey. He leaned in to whisper something to her, but Karen smacked his arm away. I saw panic flicker in her eyes for the first time. For years, she had run this neighborhood like her personal kingdom, issuing fines, enforcing ridiculous rules, making life miserable for anyone she didn't like. But now, the Queen had lost her crown. Karen's voice cracked. We will be voting on the new vehicle restrictions now. I raised a hand. Actually, no, we won't. Karen jerked her head toward me. You don't have the authority to… I literally do. I turned back to the audience. And before we make any new rules, I think we should take a look at some financial discrepancies. Karen went stiff. I pulled out another stack of papers, flipping to the first page. Let's talk about the mysterious pool renovation fees from last summer, I said. $50,000 disappeared, but the pool never got fixed. Strange, isn't it? Murmurs rippled through the crowd again. I have the receipts right here, I said, holding up bank statements, showing how HOA funds were used for a so-called community improvement project. I flipped the page. But here's the problem, I continued, my voice calm and steady. The renovation company that received the payment doesn't exist. A collective gasp filled the room. I clicked to the next slide on my laptop, and the bank account that received the funds. Karen's eyes widened. Belongs to a certain someone's personal checking account. The room exploded. That money was for the HOA, someone shouted. You stole from us. Karen grabbed her gavel again, her hands shaking. Lies! Lies! You're making things up. I scrolled to the next slide, a screenshot of her own email. Thanks for approving the transfer. Go ahead and wire it to my personal account. HOA will never notice. The room went silent. Karen turned ghost white. Her own words, now plastered on a 20-foot screen in front of the entire neighborhood. She looked around frantically. Her supporters were no longer on her side. Bob's forehead was glistening with sweat. He tugged at Karen's sleeve, whispering furiously. Karen, we need to… Shut up, Bob, she snapped. Karen whipped around to face me. You set this up, she stammered. You've been planning this for years. I shrugged. Pretty much. She clenched her fists. You think you can just take over my HOA? I smiled. Karen, I said, this was never your HOA. Karen tried to fight back. The next morning, she sent out a mass email claiming she was being forced out by big money developers. She went door to door trying to rally support. She even threatened legal action. Didn't matter. By noon, I had already filed a formal motion to dissolve the HOA board. Within 48 hours, we held a new election. Karen wasn't even nominated. Bob didn't bother showing up. And just like that, she was out. 2 weeks later, a moving truck pulled up in front of Karen's house. She had resigned from the HOA, sold her home, and was leaving the neighborhood for good. As she loaded the last box into her overpriced luxury SUV, she turned to glare at me from across the street. I smiled and gave her a little wave. She stomped into her car and sped off. And the best part? As she drove away, a parking ticket was stuck to her windshield. Turns out, her new neighborhood had an even stricter HOA, poetic justice. With Karen gone, things changed fast. We rewrote the HOA rules. No more ridiculous fines. No more petty harassment. We actually used HOA funds for real improvements. Within a month, property values skyrocketed. Turns out, people prefer living in a community, not a dictatorship. One afternoon, I was relaxing on my porch, watching kids play basketball in their driveways, something Karen had once fined people for. Then my phone buzzed. A new email. I opened it, scanning the subject line. Help! Our HOA president is out of control. What should we do? It was from a neighboring community. I smirked, leaning back in my chair. Looks like someone else was dealing with a new Karen, and I knew exactly how to handle it. The morning after Karen's spectacular downfall, I woke up to 20 missed calls and a flood of emails. Karen had spent the entire night scrambling for a way out, and when she couldn't find one, she went full nuclear. By the time I sat down with my morning coffee, she had already filed a lawsuit against me. The allegations? Fraudulent property acquisition, illegal manipulation of HOA voting rights, and my personal favorite, destroying the integrity of the neighborhood. It was so absurd, I almost felt bad for her. Almost. But Karen wasn't done. She went door to door, spinning a brand new story for anyone who would listen. She told neighbors that I was some shady real estate tycoon, planning to turn the community into a parking lot. She even faked documents claiming I was working with developers to bulldoze homes and build a massive apartment complex. Some people believed her, especially her die-hard followers, the ones who had backed every ridiculous rule she ever created. By noon, I had neighbors calling me, demanding answers. Are you really going to sell off our homes? I heard you're going to put a car dealership here. You're replacing the community park with a storage facility. I had to bite my tongue to keep from laughing. Karen had officially lost it. But I knew one thing. If I didn't shut this down fast, she'd find a way to sink her claws back in. So I did what she never expected. I let her dig her own grave. The next morning, I met with my lawyer. She slid a folder across the table, a small smirk on her face. Karen really doesn't know when to quit, does she? I opened the folder, and my smirk grew wider. Inside were months of compiled evidence. Karen's illegal fines. Karen's embezzlement. Karen's targeted harassment. Even better, bank statements showing she had used HOA funds for personal expenses. Karen had been stealing from the neighborhood for years. My lawyer folded her hands. How do you want to proceed? I tapped my fingers on the table, thinking. If I went straight to court with this, it would end her immediately. But if I let her keep running her mouth, if I let her push this lawsuit forward, then she'd be forced to defend herself publicly. And that's when she'd really crash and burn. I smiled. Let's wait, I said. Let her think she's winning. By the end of the week, Karen was back in full force. She hosted an emergency community safety meeting at her house. The subject? How to stop the hostile takeover of our neighborhood. She handed out flyers. She sent emails to every resident. She even hired a lawyer, some overpriced, sleazy guy who promised to fix her problems. But she didn't know what I had waiting for her. By the time she officially filed her lawsuit against me, I had already counterfiled. And when the court date arrived, she walked into a nightmare. The courtroom was packed. Neighbors came. HOA members. Even a few local news reporters, because the word had spread. Karen, the once all-powerful HOA dictator, was finally being taken down. She walked in, head high, wearing an outfit that screamed, "Rich victim." Her new lawyer sat beside her, oozing confidence. They really thought they had a case. And then my lawyer stood up. Your Honor, before we address the plaintiff's claims, I'd like to introduce evidence of systematic financial fraud and abuse of power within the HOA. Karen's lawyer barely reacted until my lawyer clicked the first slide on the projector. A bank statement, one that showed $50,000 in HOA funds, had been wired to a private account. The recipient? Karen Mitchell. Her lawyer's face dropped. Karen's entire body stiffened. But that was just the start. We clicked to the next slide. A recording of Karen's voice, taken from the last HOA meeting. She was laughing, saying, "Of course I make up violations. How else can we keep control?" Then another clip. One where she said, "People like the Thompsons don't belong here. I'll fine them until they get the message." The courtroom went dead silent. Karen's face turned a shade of red I had never seen before. Her lawyer leaned over, whispering something frantically, but she didn't respond. She was too busy watching her empire crumble. Then we showed the emails, the ones where she bragged about using HOA fines to pay for her Hawaii vacations. The ones where she blackmailed other board members into supporting her. The ones where she rewrote HOA rules to benefit her friends. When the last email was read aloud, the judge leaned forward, his expression hard. "Mrs. Mitchell, do you have anything to say for yourself?" Karen's mouth opened and closed, but no words came out. For the first time in her life, she was speechless. Her lawyer muttered, "Your Honor, I need a moment with my client." But it was too late. The judge banged his gavel. "Not only is this lawsuit dismissed, but I am ordering a full audit of the HOA's finances." Karen visibly flinched. And then came the final nail in the coffin. The judge turned to me. "Mr. Thompson, given your legal control over the HOA, you have the right to motion for the immediate removal of all board members involved in this misconduct." I stood up. "I'd like to motion for a new HOA board with elected members who will actually serve the community." The judge nodded. "Motion approved." And just like that, Karen was out. For good. That night, Karen sent one final email to the neighborhood. She claimed she was stepping down voluntarily. She called me a corrupt businessman and warned that the neighborhood was doomed without her leadership. But no one believed her. And the next morning, her house went up for sale. By the end of the month, she was gone. The neighborhood breathed a collective sigh of relief. We held our first real HOA meeting without her. And this time, there were no threats, no ridiculous fines, just neighbors working together, the way it was supposed to be. As I sat back in my chair, listening to people actually discuss real improvements, I realized something. Karen had spent years ruling this place with an iron fist, but the moment people stood up, the moment we took back control, she collapsed. Because at the end of the day, people don't fear bullies once they realize the bully has nothing left to stand on. The first thing people noticed was the silence. For years, Karen's voice had been an unavoidable part of life in the neighborhood. She was always there, patrolling in her pastel power suits, barking orders about grass height, sending out emails packed with passive-aggressive threats. And now, nothing. No HOA violation notices stuffed in mailboxes. No smug glares from across the street. No Karen. Just peace. It felt unnatural at first, like the neighborhood was waiting for her to pop out from behind a bush with a clipboard in hand. But then something amazing happened. People started talking to each other again. Neighbors who had spent years avoiding each other out of fear of HOA spies were suddenly chatting over their fences, inviting each other for coffee, organizing community events. Without Karen lurking in every shadow, people felt like they could actually live their lives. No one was measuring grass with a ruler. No one was patrolling for parked cars. And for the first time in a decade, kids could ride their bikes in the street without someone calling in a complaint. The new HOA board met for the first time in the community center. And instead of talking about how to punish people, we talked about how to actually improve the neighborhood. We reallocated the budget. Instead of Karen's personal expense account, the money actually went into things people cared about. Fixing the community pool, repaving cracked sidewalks, adding new streetlights for safety. We even started a community garden. The irony? It was in the exact spot where Karen used to stand and take pictures of people's violations. A few of her former supporters approached me in the following weeks, looking embarrassed. They admitted they had only backed Karen because they were afraid of being targeted next. One even handed me an HOA violation notice from last year. It was for an unsightly mailbox. The unsightly mailbox in question? A completely normal black mailbox. Karen had been fining people for nonsense for years, and now that she was gone, the full absurdity of it all was sinking in. By the end of the month, something even more unexpected happened. Property values shot up by 15%. The same HOA that Karen had claimed was protecting home values had actually been driving them down. Turns out people didn't want to live in a neighborhood ruled by an unhinged dictator. They wanted to live somewhere where they could breathe. And with Karen gone, they finally could. A few weeks later, I was sitting on my porch, watching my daughter and her friends play basketball in our driveway. A simple thing. Something that had been banned under Karen's rule. The sound of bouncing basketballs, of kids laughing, was better than any revenge I could have planned. That's when my phone buzzed. A new email. The subject line. "Help! Our HOA president is out of control." I clicked it open. The message was from a homeowner in a different neighborhood, a few towns over. Apparently their HOA had a Karen of their own. She was handing out massive fines for things like too many bird feeders and decorative flags that don't match the color scheme. And she had just increased monthly fees by 30%. The homeowner had seen the news coverage of what happened in our neighborhood. They wanted to know if I had any advice. I chuckled, leaning back in my chair. Karen's reign may have ended here, but there were other Karens out there. And now, people knew they could fight back. I cracked my knuckles and started typing. First things first, tell me everything about your HOA bylaws. You're going to need a plan.